Either Senator Moran or I will be back shortly.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. You know how much I like having the gavel. Director Wray, thank you, first of all, for being here today. Your agency is so important in so many areas, in so many ways. All of us are clearly horrified by the vicious killings that occurred yesterday. And I want to ask you about one approach that's been taken and get your judgment about it. The state of Maine is among some states that have enacted statutes that we call either a red or yellow flag law. And the law in Maine, which was developed in consultation with a wide range of groups, essentially allows the court to have the police temporarily confiscate firearms from someone who is deemed to be a danger to either him or herself or to others. Importantly, the Maine law includes due process rights and a medical assessment. So it can't be just some neighbor's opinion or even a family member's opinion. There has to be a medical assessment as well. And that's to ensure that the concerns are well-founded and that Second Amendment rights for law-abiding citizens are protected. In your experience, how successful have these relatively new red flag and yellow flag laws been?
It's a very good question. I would say I'm not sure that I've seen any kind of rigorous assessment overall of the effectiveness of the so-called red flag laws. There are other names for it, as you alluded to. I know that DOJ has recently published a model statute for states to consider. I think what I could say to you is that it's been our experience that with a whole wide variety of shooter situations, whether it's a terrorist type situation or a more traditional violent criminal situation, most of the time you see that there was someone who knew the person or came into contact with the person who saw some change in behavior that alarmed them. And in the situations where law enforcement has been successful at preventing an attack, it's almost always thanks to somebody like that coming forward. And whether it's done through a protective order of the sort, a protection order of the sort you're describing, or whether it's just because they contacted law enforcement and law enforcement was able to act, that's the key. And the ones that haven't been prevented, an awful lot of the time, it turns out there was somebody who maybe didn't know to contact law enforcement or was afraid to contact law enforcement for one reason or another. And you hear all the time the saying, if you see something, say something. And most people, when they hear that, they picture the unattended backpack, in the Greyhound bus terminal or something. But what we really need right now in this country is if you see something about somebody, people to say something. And if they do, whether it's through statutes like the one in Maine or through some other mechanism, that can be quite effective. And certainly, if more states were to adopt these laws, we would, on our end, through NICS and NCIC, have to make arrangements to be able to then have that information in the relevant databases to be able to help prevent them from getting their hands on a weapon. But certainly it's something we could look at.
Thank you. Another proposal that I've long supported would strengthen federal law by making it easier for prosecutors to go after gun traffickers and straw purchasers. And let me describe what I've seen and heard about in the state of Maine from law enforcement officers. Gangs and drug dealers target addicts who have clean records. So they then ask them to purchase guns for them, and they swap heroin or other drugs for the guns. These guns are then used to commit horrific crimes in our communities, often far from Maine. There was a gang in Connecticut that was known for coming to Maine, enlisting addicts to buy guns for them because the addicts had clean records and could pass the background check. So this Congress, I once again joined my colleague, Senator Leahy, in reintroducing the Stop Illegal Trafficking in Firearms Act. And we would create a new criminal offense for straw purchasing. Right now, it's essentially treated as a paperwork violation, a slap on the wrist. Instead, we would make these crimes punishable by time behind bars. What is your opinion of closing that straw purchaser loophole that allows for criminal gangs to access guns when they could not buy them themselves because of their own criminal records?
Well, I think I would have to study the legislation more closely to give you a more informed assessment of that. I will tell you that even back to when I was a line prosecutor, I used to prosecute a lot of these same straw purchaser cases, and typically, as you say, they're prosecuted as false statements cases, you know, when somebody essentially lies on the 4473 form. And just as you say, what you see over and over all is violent gang members who enlist people who are down on their luck for one reason or another. Either they're, as you say, they're addicts, or they're financially in distress. And so the money that comes with it, when they get paid to be the straw purchaser, they take advantage of people who are down on their luck that way. I think there might be a difference in the culpability level for the straw purchaser versus the gang member who enlists them. And that's when I tried those cases and prosecuted those cases, that was sort of the approach we took. But I think you're right to be focused on the straw purchaser issue as an important ingredient to preventing guns from getting in the hands of people who are, after all, prohibited under existing law from having them.
Right. I actually feel bad for many of the straw purchasers because they frequently have serious substance abuse problems, and they're being manipulated and used by these gang members. But that is a real problem. Let me follow up on the drug issue. And as we know, America has set a terrible new record in the number of drug overdoses in the past year. It's 104,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. In Maine, an estimated 636 people died of drug overdoses in 2021. That's a 23% increase from the previous year. But what to me is even or equally chilling is the fact that that's actually only a small portion of the number of overdoses. The number of overdoses in Maine that we know about was nearly 9,000. Fortunately, the rest of them were saved. I talked to Attorney General Garland about this issue, and he pointed out that the FBI, along with other DOJ components, is playing an important role in fighting the large-scale drug trafficking organizations that are bringing drugs into this country. I am concerned about what is happening at the southern border based on my discussion with border control agents. Has the government's inability to secure the southern border led to more drugs entering the United States?
Well, certainly the influx of drugs across the southern border is a very important fuel, not just to addiction in this country, but to violence in this country. And that's one of the parts that the FBI plays a pretty big role in. You have transnational criminal organizations in Mexico enlisting the help of gangs and other organizations here in the U.S. to distribute the drugs, and there's violence over turf, over distribution routes, et cetera. I know that when I've been down to the border and talked to the CBP folks there and to our field offices that have responsibility in that area, the quantity of the seizures that they routinely are engaged in make the seizures in other parts of the country look really quite small by comparison. I mean, it's just another day in the life for a lot of them, and so it's striking. And I think you're correct that the overdose death statistic or the overdose statistic itself in some ways underestimates the scope of the problem, in part because Narcan happily has become so much more widely available, but that in turn ends up almost masking the problem. So the effectiveness of first response, which is a good thing, is actually maybe misleading some into thinking that the problem is not as bad as it really is, and it's really an epidemic.
And finally, just a quick question. You were talking about domestic terrorism with Senator Capito. Would you agree that the sources of domestic terrorism include groups and ideologies on the left, on the right, from overseas, such as ISIS? In other words, there's not just one ideological source of domestic terrorism, is there?
Certainly, when we look at domestic terrorism, we focus on the violence, and we're sort of ideology agnostic, if you will. And the terrorism, the domestic terrorism threat we see covers the waterfront from people. We don't use terms like left and right, but we see the racially motivated violent extremists. We see militia violence and anarchist violence. We see people with this kind of salad bar of ideologies that don't fit into any category. And then, of course, we tend to bucket it under the international terrorism side, the ISIS-inspired folks who are here. They're not sent here by ISIS, but they're here and they're radicalized online. That's a huge category, and the plot that we disrupted that was talked about earlier involving the attempt to kill former President Bush is a good example of that threat. So I think I understand the focus on ideology, but for us, the focus has to be on the violence to make sure that we're not missing something in that regard.
And that's where it should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Collins. Senator Braun.